Welcome to the Politics and Media programme. This year, most students going to university have had to pay £9,000 in tuition fees for the first time. The government claims it doesn't have the money to fund higher education in any other way. Yet the scheme saves the government no money. So is this a case of free market ideology wrecking higher education? That's certainly what many students thought when the new fees were announced in 2010. Then they protested in such numbers that many commentators argued that a new age of student rebellion had dawned. But last week, a small student demonstration ended in scuffles between protesters themselves. So where does this leave us in the debate about student fees and the future of higher education? Joining me in the studio are Michael Chesham, an organiser for the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts and a member of the NUS Executive, and Robert Oxley, Campaigns Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to you both. Michael, so what do you think the impact of the introduction of fees has been on the student body? This is the first year. Is it as bad as people thought that it would be?
Well, I think it would be. It's not realistic to expect the kind of dramatic drop-off that some people are arguing that would have to happen in order for it to have an effect. I think two things. Firstly, that the introduction of £9,000 fees is having a lot of impact on the ability and more importantly maybe the will of people, especially from poorer backgrounds, to go to university. But I think it's also important that we take the government's reforms in higher education in the round. So we're not just talking about £9,000 fees, which means debt aversity, which means that people aren't willing to take on that kind of debt, and that specifically affects people from poorer backgrounds. But much more importantly, maybe the structural impact of the fees system is coming into full swing, and that means that the impact, the kind of cuts that we have to see in institutions like London Met is disproportionately meted out onto universities which ordinary working class people rely on to go to, and which are disproportionately funded by teaching grants. Now at places like UCL, where I'm currently a student, where it's research orientated, the old posh universities, as it were, are doing relatively well out of this system. So yes, the £9,000 fee system is having an impact. It is having an impact on applications, and maybe more importantly, it's having a huge impact on the whole structure of higher education, and a deeply regressive one.
So Robert, this scheme isn't going to make the government any money until 2040 on most serious projections. So why is it a good idea from your point of view?
Well, first, I think it's ridiculous to claim that the new system actually makes it more expensive for those from a poorer background. Figures have shown that actually the new system compared to the old is more progressive. And that ultimately, somebody who is from a poorer background at the moment will be paying less in their lifetime than they would have gone in the current system. In fact, myself, had I gone through the current system today, I would have paid a lot less money. I actually struggled to pay the tuition fees up front. So I think this is one of
paying it back at £21,000.
I would have been paying it back at a later date, and then if I earned more, I would have then ended up paying a lot more.
But £21,000 is £7,000 below the average wage in London. So it's
still £7,000. It's £6,000 more than the current threshold. So I think the changes. I think we have to get careful, and this is the problem that we have with the current debate over tuition fees. It has been dogged by rhetoric, by dogma, by the ideas that people are going to lose out. Now, ultimately, I think there is a debate to be had about how we fund our universities and whether the right system having. And it's clear that some students looking at this are being put off. But is that a fault of the system, or is that a fault of those who are introducing the system, the way they've explained it and the way that people have argued about it? I would say that it's definitely been the way the system's been sold.
But let's return to my question. If this isn't making the government any money until 2040, which is to say we can't really tell whether it's ever going to make the government any money, why is it a good idea?
Well, the system increases the amount of public and private investment in higher education overall. So there is more money going into the system overall. Yes, it has shifted the balance away from taxpayer funding of higher education to those who are going to benefit. Those students who are going to benefit from degrees in the next 20 years because they will earn more, they'll have had that experience at university. They are paying more than taxpayers so there has been a shift in the burden. And I think we should have that debate, and I'm unashamed to say that shift is the right one.
Okay, Michael, Robert doesn't want to give us the answer to that question. What do you think the answer to the question is? Why the government says it's to save money, but it isn't saving money. So why do you think they're doing it?
We heard from Rob briefly about this idea of dogma. I think this is a very important question. Look, in a world of perfect information, in which information and education travelled completely equally, regardless of whether or not your parents went to university, regardless of the kind of institutional knowledge that you have to make a calculated decision about whether or not to go to university and which university to go to, which by and large people from ruling class, middle class backgrounds are going to be much better equipped to make, then we might be in a position where we could say that this wouldn't have a directly regressive effect. But even then, why are we going down this road of bringing private money into the system? We have a system for making people who benefit from higher education pay back some of that money. It's called income tax, it's called corporation tax, it's called progressive taxation. We should be using that. This is absolutely expressly about ideology, expressly about dogma. Now, we have the Taxpayers Alliance, that has a direct stated ideological purpose to bring private money into public services.
But you can go on with your own little smears here. The point here, the debate is how do we fund higher education?
Yeah.
And should it be students and graduates who are going to benefit from that education, or is it going to be taxpayers? Now the point is if you go, they're not the same thing. And what you're arguing is it is a case of who pays, and what this system does with the £9,000, effectively it acts as a graduate tax. It specifically taxes those individuals who are going to benefit from their education, who are going to earn more, who are going to have their time at education.
But isn't it then a more bureaucratic way of getting to the same end as general taxation? Because
the point is in general taxation...
Just let me ask the question, then you can answer it, and that'd probably be a good way to conduct an interview. If it's the case that people benefit financially from going into higher education, which not all people do, in fact, in today's world, quite a lot of graduates come out and don't get higher than average paid jobs. But if they do, then they will pay more general taxation. So surely somebody who's in favour of taxpayers getting value for money should favour a less bureaucratic way of recouping the money rather than a more bureaucratic way of doing so.
Well, there's 2 points. Those who, as you say, who go to university and who don't get a benefit, they will actually pay less under this system because they won't get the threshold, and over the period, they won't have to pay more. So I think it addresses that point. And then with higher education, ultimately, if you do just fund it out of general taxation, it means that every taxpayer, whether they went to university or not, is paying for higher education. So you then have a system where higher education is benefiting a small amount, but is being paid by everybody else. And so that is a system where we have spending at the moment, where we are spending more money than we take in, and we're passing on those burdens to future generations. And it's about who pays. So ultimately, if you aren't for tuition fees, if you aren't for this system, you have to argue who does pay. And the answer there appears to be everybody else.
No, this idea that we can abstract, that we can separate the taxpayer from the people who go to university is absolutely absurd. Either you believe in public services or you don't. Either you think that there are some things in society which should be collectively owned, that have collective benefit and should therefore be paid for collectively, or you don't. Now, it's clear that from what we're saying, he doesn't believe that, and he doesn't believe that education is one of those things. And we're not talking about a graduate tax. I'm against a graduate tax. I think that education should be free. I think there should be living grants. I think that should be funded through taxing the rich.
When you say free, you mean somebody else should pay for it?
Well, yeah, but that's an absurd. That's what
you're saying. When you're saying education should be free, what you're arguing is that I should go to education. Right. I should not pay for it up front, but somebody else should pay for it.
You're absolutely right to say that this is a question of who pays. But the idea that there is any such thing as a free public service in the round, no one is arguing that. No one is arguing that free education would be free, full stop. Obviously, someone's going to have to pay for this. The point is who pays, and you've put your finger on the button there. Who pays? Well, we have a system for that. It's called general progressive taxation, and we're not talking about graduate tax. We're talking about debt, and I think that's a very much more pernicious idea.
I'm a little bit puzzled by your argument, Robert, because you say that only those people who benefit from education should pay for it, and the people who don't benefit from it directly shouldn't pay for it. Do you have this?
I wouldn't make it as black and white at that point.
Well, you did. But do you have the same approach to healthcare, that only ill people should pay for healthcare and healthy people shouldn't have to the protection of the police, that only those people who are the victims of crime should pay for the police and not those people who aren't. I mean, I've barely...
But you never know whether you're going to be a victim of a crime or whether you're going to fall ill. So,
Well,
this is not arguing against public investment in education, about taxpayers funding higher education. There will still be taxpayers investing in higher education. But the point is where should the majority of that burden fall? And I would argue that the majority of that burden should fall on the person who is going to benefit the most from it, because there is not an endless.
Employers?
There's not going
Employers
to be.
Benefit the most
there's not.
from education.
Well, employers don't pay tax. Employees pay tax. We all, you pay tax because as an individual, it's your labour. But the point here is where should that burden fall? And I would argue, and this is why the IFS have argued this. This is why people like Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, individuals who've looked at this objectively, not with a political slant, not with an ideological slant, have said, where does the burden now fall? And the IFS said very clearly that the burden has been shifted from the taxpayer to the student and to the graduate who are going to benefit from that. And that burden has been shifted from upfront, where they're paying tuition fees upfront, to over their lifetime. Now, yes, it is debt. They are going to be in debt, but that doesn't affect their credit rating. It doesn't affect their mortgages. It's not going to affect your chance to build a home, and you're not going to suddenly have to pay £9,000 up front. But what you are going to do is, as a student, as you earn more money, you're going to have to pay more of it back because you're going to benefit from it. And as I said, if I had a choice today of having gone through the old system where I struggled to pay those tuition fees up front, I had to work for university, got absolutely very little support, and the benefits weren't explained to me, or I got this system today, I would choose this system every time.
Michael?
Firstly, this isn't an argument between the old system and the new system. This is an argument about how higher education should be funded. No one is arguing that we should be reintroducing the old broken system of £3,000 fees with all the problems that came with that, though I think actually the current system that we've now got is significantly worse than the old system. But in any case, this entire argument is underwritten that you can somehow purchase education like a lollipop. Like, who is it who has the institutional knowledge to make calculated, rational choice decisions about where they go to university, how they go to university, and what subjects they study? The answer to that is overwhelmingly people whose parents have gone to university, people who are in a position with the grades to go to better universities and to get graduate premiums. This idea of the amount that you earn over your lifetime it's your cost-benefit analysis in this new consumer model. The people who are able to get the most out of that cost-benefit analysis are overwhelmingly students from wealthier backgrounds and not those from poorer backgrounds. And in any case, this system of tuition fees that we're seeing isn't just about tuition fees keeping the current scenario stable but with different money in it. This is a complete restructuring of how higher education is funded and how it's run. And what that will mean is a cuts to student numbers, especially at universities like London Met, very short walk from here, and it will mean disproportionate concentrations of funding in places that can afford to charge higher tuition fees, especially against postgraduates and international students who, of course, don't get any upfront support, and towards universities who are research-based. And at the same time, with graduate employment falling through the floor and tuition fees going through the roof, this cost-benefit analysis, this graduate premium, which all of these supposedly compliant consumers are supposed to make, will actually mean that if you come out of high school with poorer grades, not through any fault of your own, but because you didn't go to the kind of school where people got good grades, and you are pushed into going to a university that's maybe less prestigious than some, your cost-benefit analysis, your graduate premium could well be negative.
Let me just ask you about the protests then, because, if this is the case and if students feel like this, why was that demonstration last week so small compared to the ones in 2010, and why did it end in such a car crash?
I mean, I think the demonstrations that we've now seen, we saw a demonstration in 2011 as well, called by the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, and we've seen another autumn demonstration come out this year. I think positively it was the right thing to do to call a national demo. I think that the state of play is very different to 2010. We're not going at a parliamentary vote. There isn't this sense of immediate urgency, this immediate campaign to win something directly. What this now has to be about is building a big, broad coalition about showing in the streets that we're willing to mobilise in favour of public education. And was a small turnout indicative of students' unwillingness to fight that? I don't think so. I think that the mood on campuses, especially amongst those who are paying £9,000 fees now, is very angry. but it's also very disillusioned with their own leadership. It's disillusioned with the NUS leadership. NUS called this demonstration under the slogan of educate, employ, empower, which clearly isn't a sharp political alternative. The National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts and ULU, we call the march a feeder demonstration under a much sharper political alternative, tax the rich to fund education. But when you have a weak slogan and simultaneously a weak route, we were asked to march to Kennington, 2 miles into South London in Zone 2 next to Oval Cricket Ground. I think that there was a real sense of unease, a real sense of hostility towards the NUS leadership, and in the end that was expressed.
Not a good picture when that's expressed like that, though, is it? I mean, people trying to stop demonstrators going to Kennington, other demonstrators in a fight on the demonstration, invading the stage. It's not a sensible way to proceed. I mean, you might be right in the argument, but it's not a sensible way to proceed.
No, but simultaneously, I don't think it's the place for us to get into this giant. I mean, the problem we have is that the student movement's divided. I think it's divided because I think the NUS leadership has played a weak hand, and I think the blame fundamentally lies there. And it will divide us further if we now get into the blame game, if we now get into condemning everyone who was involved in whatever action. I think the best thing that we can do is to draw the political lessons of it, which are that if you want to call a demonstration, you've got to do it with a sharp route and a sharp political alternative, and move on that basis. And that basis has to be about creating a sustained campaign for public education. We're not marching at Parliament anymore, we march on Parliament.
Robert, does it worry you that, I mean, leaving aside what the exact level of the student mobilisation might be at any time, if you look at British Social Attitude Survey, the attitude towards marketising the education system are very much antagonistic to the point of view that you've been representing. Does it worry you that although it might be government policy, it's a very isolated position?
Look, I think I'll be the first one to say the government has done a terrible job of explaining this policy. It's not perfect. No one pretend that, and I think there are issues there which have to be looked at. But the alternative that has been put forward here is free education, as you say. The idea that students shouldn't have to pay anything, that it should be out of general taxation. Now, the only people arguing that is a very tiny minority. Not even the NUS; it's a tiny minority within the NUS. NUS
policy is free education.
NUS has traditionally been exploited by very radical but very very motivated, very passionate individuals on a very small politically left ideology, opinion. That has been throughout university. That's what it was like when I was at university. That's when it always has been the way the people who organised.
It's an incubator for Labour MPs. Jack Straw, Charles Clarke.
I think if it is, then there will still be those quite left-wing MPs. But ultimately, people are able to express their opinion. It's great that they're out there. Problem is that too often these marches have been overtaken by a very small minority. It's why so many students are put off. It's why I think there was actually a counter-protest against the NUS at this protest, at this march. Look, and they weren't greatly organised. I was also at the marches in 2010 when there was the vote. I actually sat in a window overlooking the vote at the time when it was happening. I watched all the violence descend down onto that. I'm sure some students have been put off by that. Either way, the NUS isn't getting it right. Students, I don't think, are articulating their opinion well. I don't think the people who are supposedly representing them are articulating those points very well. But there is also there's no political leaders out there from any political party who are arguing to abolish fees, to go for free education. The only people arguing that are a very small minority of NUS.
Yeah, but that is part of the political crisis in this country, isn't it? Because there's nobody arguing that, but a majority of people believe it. There's nobody arguing.
I wouldn't say a majority of people.
I'm relying on British Socialist Attitude Survey, which is the government's own survey of public opinion. It's the most systematic survey of public opinion, and it shows, for instance, that 85% of people in this country want no more privatisation whatsoever. Now, one definition of the political crisis in this country is that nobody inside the establishment political spectrum represents that view, just as nobody in the political spectrum, apart from Lord Ashdown more recently, represents the 85% of people in this country who think that the troops should be withdrawn from Afghanistan. So when people talk about the democratic deficit, you're pointing to it, but that's exactly what the problem is.
I point to it all the time, and I say, look, our political leaders have to sometimes represent, and they also have to lead, and there are two sides of it. But I don't think it is putting two sides to the story. There is the side that people don't want, as you say, the social attitudes. They don't want private universities, but at the same time, they don't feel that ordinary, somebody who is earning £19,000 a year they shouldn't be subsidising the education of somebody who's going to go on and earn £30,000 a year.
But this is complacent.
And so it's getting those 2 points together.
Complacent and dogmatic. What this is this assertion somehow that left-wing ideas or the ideas of public services, of publicly funded education, are somehow so out there that no matter how popular they are, they can just be dismissed as a fringe minority. Just after Millbank happened, when Tory Party HQ was occupied in 2010, tabloid newspapers had to delete polls from their websites and from their papers on the next day because the support, when it was worded, and I think I quote, "Do you still support the student movement after these riots?" was so positive towards the student movement. And I actually think that what you're saying is right, that the public are with us on this. And I think for as long as you can, you can stand there and say, it's all a big conspiracy of this tiny fringe minority. Actually, no. Actually, maybe some of us do have radical politics, but I think that the overwhelming feeling of the British population is behind the student movement.
I dispute that completely. And you can talk about online polls which can be easily taken away. Actual polling showed that there was a real outcry at some of the violence of what happened with the students.
But actual polling led to a situation at the last general election where a party which had this policy got a minority of the vote, and two parties that didn't have this policy got a majority of the vote, and the party that didn't have this policy is only in power because one of the parties sided with it in a coalition. So the actual vote amongst the voters, specifically on the question of student fees, is not the picture.
If you want to talk about the party policies, you had the Lib Dems who shamelessly courted student votes, promising something they knew was unaffordable and undeliverable. And you had the Labour Review, who had set up the Brown Review, knowing that effectively that they could set this up and then kind of leave this as a ticking time bomb. Now look, it's not our job to kind of say which political party was right, but ultimately there isn't this public opinion, going forward that student education should be free, and at the point that most people kind of accept the point that if students are going to benefit from this system, and we know that they are going to benefit from their education, that ultimately the burden of paying for that education should fall more squarely on theirs. Not entirely, but should fall more squarely onto their.
Every bit of polling data that's ever been done on tuition fees has showed how unpopular they are. Every bit of polling that's been done on privatising the NHS has showed how unpopular it is. Every bit of polling that's been done on something like, foreign wars in Afghanistan and Iraq has shown how unpopular they are. This assertion that somehow, because it's mainstream, because all of the major political parties are saying it, somehow it has to be true. Actually, people don't accept that education should be paid for, because actually there's a real feeling out there, I think amongst the vast majority of the population, that public services are worth fighting for. And education should be one of those public services. And ultimately, if you want a public service, you've got to fund it publicly. The only way to fund publicly accessible education is to make it free, and is to make it paid for out of general taxation. Now, actually, I think that the point about no one is proposing an NHS tax, no one is proposing a police tax. The idea that because the user contributions to public services, very, very, very Blairite, it begins with Thatcher, runs all the way through Blair's premiership. This idea that
the most successful prime minister that Labour have had in a very long time,
now one of the most unpopular. I think that there is a real wind of change in terms of relationship in terms of the public opinion about how public services are funded. And I think that has shifted vastly against user contributions, and therefore against tuition fees, which are basically a user contribution. We have a system for making people who benefit from education pay for it. It's called income tax. It's called corporation tax.
But that tax is not paying. We do not have enough from those tax receipts to pay for what we have today. So we have to look at
raise it.
So you want there's the answer. Do you want higher taxes? Yeah. You want higher taxes from everybody else to fund your education.
I want higher taxes from the highest earners, from the rich.
So that highest earners already pay about 11% of the income tax. No, sorry, the highest about 8% currently pay about 27% of the income tax. So you want more on them. You want to base our economy on taxing just a very small. It's very easy to say tax the rich, but the point here is that we actually need a system which is stable. We need a system which actually goes forward in the long run.
And the public
idea
is
that
tired and impatient of hearing talk like that. The public is tired and impatient of hearing about corporations tax dodging, hearing about the rich getting away with murder with their tax
I'm going to have to
bills.
stop you there because that's all we've got time for in this section of the programme. No doubt we'll be returning to the question of higher education and student protests in future editions of the Politics and Media Show, but we've still got the second half to go. We'll be looking at the government's Justice and Security Bill, so join us then.